In a dusty parking lot, a battle-scarred veteran watched as a drunken stranger dragged a limp German shepherd out of an old pickup, its eyes dull and legs lifeless. The deal was desperate, the dog forgotten, but within days, what everyone believed was impossible would shake an entire town and change two lives forever. Before I show you what happened when this paralyzed dog took his first steps, can I ask you something? If you believe that even the most broken souls, human or animal, deserve a second chance, and that stories like Jake and Shadows can inspire real healing, please hit that subscribe button. Most people ignore moments like this, but your one click might help this message reach someone who's barely holding on. Jake Reynolds had learned to live with silence, not the peaceful kind that makes you feel calm, the kind that screams in your ears when you close your eyes, the kind that follows you home from war and won't let you forget. That's the silence Jake had carried for years. He didn't talk much anymore, didn't go out unless he had to. His neighbors barely knew his name. To most people in that small dusty town, he was just that vet who keeps to himself. But on that particular Tuesday afternoon, the world gave him no choice but to speak. Jake was heading home from the VA clinic, another appointment that left him numb. They called it therapy, but for Jake, it felt like answering questions that dug up ghosts. He drove his old Dodge Ram down the same streets he always did, eyes hidden behind scratched-up sunglasses. Same potholes, same bakery with the closed sign even when it was open, same corner store with the rusted-out ice machine that hadn't worked since last year. He wasn't planning to stop, but then he saw something strange in the parking lot next to the gas station. A beat-up blue pickup, idling with smoke puffing out the exhaust, and a man slouched unshaven, barely upright, grabbing something out of the truck bed. Jake slowed down. He didn't know why, just something didn't sit right. The man, clearly drunk, shouted something Jake couldn't quite make out. Then, without a second of care, he yanked a shape out of the truck by a rope. A dog, a German shepherd, its legs dragged behind it uselessly as it hit the ground. No reaction, no resistance, just dead weight sliding across gravel. Jake parked, stepped out of his truck, his boots crunched on the broken asphalt. "What are you doing?" he asked flatly, eyes locked on the limp animal. The man swayed, blinked hard and slurred. "Selling it." Jake frowned. "Selling it? Like this?" "Yeah, $200. Take it or leave it." The man kicked the rear tire of his truck. "Dog don't work. Had it for months. Won't walk. Probably never will. I'm getting rid of it tonight either way." That sentence, "won't walk, probably never will," echoed inside Jake's head louder than he expected. The dog's eyes barely moved. Dull, dry, like it had already given up. Its fur was dirty, patchy, ribs clearly visible. But the part that hit Jake hardest, the dog didn't even flinch when the man raised his boot near its head. Just stayed there, breathing slow, like it had learned that nothing was ever going to get better. Jake had felt that before, in a field of dust and blood, on nights when the bombs wouldn't stop falling, on mornings when the only sound was the heartbeat in your ears and the ringing of what you survived. "Where'd you get him?" Jake asked. The man shrugged. "Found him. He used to belong to some guy up the road. Don't matter. He's useless now. You want him or not." Jake should have walked away. He wasn't looking for a pet. He barely fed himself some nights. Dogs were work. They needed care, food, time. But still he reached for his wallet. Something inside him screamed that this wasn't about logic. This was about not letting one more soul be thrown away. He pulled out $200, handed it to the man, without another word. The man grinned, his teeth yellow and chipped, took the money, and left without even looking back. Jake knelt beside the shepherd. "Hey," he said softly. No response, just slow, tired breathing. Jake gently slid his arms under the dog, lifted him off the ground. He expected the dog to whimper, resist something, but it just rested its head on Jake's arm, as if it had finally given up waiting for someone to care. He laid the dog across the back seat of his truck, took off his flannel shirt, and tucked it under the dog's head, turned on the AC, and drove. All the way home, he kept glancing into the mirror. The dog didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even make a sound. Jake's heart was racing, but he didn't know why. It was just a dog, right? So why did it feel like he'd just picked up a part of himself? Jake's home was small, a one-story fixer-upper with peeling white paint and a porch swing that hadn't swung in years. Inside was neat but empty. No pictures, no decorations, just a man and his silence. He laid the dog on a blanket in the corner of the living room, set out a bowl of water, boiled some chicken, chopped it small, and set it near the dog's mouth. Nothing. Jake sat on the floor across from him, legs crossed. "I don't even know your name," he said quietly. The dog's ear twitched, just slightly. Jake looked closer. "Did you hear me?" No answer, just silence. But that was more than enough to keep Jake talking. That night, Jake didn't sleep. Every few hours, he checked to see if the dog was still breathing. He was, barely. At 3:07 a.m., Jake sat in the dark living room, just watching. "I shouldn't have brought you here," he whispered. He wasn't talking to the dog anymore. He was talking to himself. Because bringing something fragile into a place that feels broken, it's a dangerous thing. But then the dog stirred. Its eyes opened, just for a moment, and for the first time, it looked at Jake. Not through him, not past him, but at him. Jake leaned forward. "Hey!" A low, dry sound came from the dog's throat. Not a growl, not a whine, just acknowledgement. Jake exhaled. He didn't know it yet, but in that second, something shifted. The next morning, Jake took him to the nearest vet, 40 miles out of town. Dr. Monica Lane, a no-nonsense woman in her late 40s, took one look and raised an eyebrow. "He's in bad shape," she said, "but he's not beyond hope." Jake stared. "But he can't walk." "Doesn't mean he never will. His muscles are weak. Maybe some trauma. No clear spinal damage. We'll need tests. X-rays." Jake nodded. "Do them all." She tilted her head. "You sure? This won't be cheap." Jake nodded again. Money was money. This was something else. By the time he got home that night, the dog was back on his blanket, still not eating, still not moving much. But something had changed. The eyes weren't dull anymore. They followed Jake as he moved around the room, tracked him from kitchen to couch, watched quietly. 3 days later, the vet called. "He's not paralyzed," Dr. Lane said. "It's psychological." Jake's brows furrowed. "Like trauma." "Exactly. Think of it like his body gave up because his mind did. He wasn't treated right, probably caged, starved." He stopped trying. Jake nodded slowly. He understood more than he wanted to admit. "What do I do?" Dr. Lane paused, then said, "You give him a reason to try again." Jake hung up the phone and looked across the room. The shepherd was still lying in the corner, head resting on his paws, watching. Jake knelt beside him. "You ever been in a war?" he said softly. "Not the kind with guns, the kind inside your head." The dog blinked. Jake smiled just a little. "Me too." That night, Jake sat beside the dog again, cross-legged on the hardwood floor. The house was silent, just the soft hum of the fridge and the ticking of the old wall clock. He talked about things he hadn't spoken out loud in years. About Lance Corporal Miller, the kid who made everybody laugh and died during a supply run. About the roadside bomb that left him buried under debris, hearing nothing but his own pulse. About coming home and feeling like a ghost, like someone who came back in one piece, but never really returned. Shadow, because that's what Jake had started calling him, didn't move. But his eyes never left Jake, and as the word spilled out, something strange happened. Jake didn't feel as alone anymore. The days started to form a rhythm, a quiet, broken rhythm, but it was something. Jake would wake early, sometimes from nightmares, sometimes just out of habit. He'd make coffee, leave the news on mute, and boil chicken or rice for Shadow. At first, Shadow didn't eat unless Jake hand-fed him. Then, one morning, Jake walked into the room to find the bowl empty and Shadow looking at him like, "Well, what's next?" That was the first small victory. Jake didn't cheer. He didn't smile wide. He just nodded. "Good, that's good." He didn't want to scare the moment away. He carried Shadow outside now, gently, like a soldier carries the wounded. He laid him in the grass in the backyard, under the only tree that gave decent shade. Shadow would lie there, ears twitching at the birds, nose sniffing the breeze. It was peaceful, but also it wasn't enough. Jake wanted more for him. So, every afternoon, Jake sat with Shadow and gently rubbed his legs, one at a time, moved them in small circles, flexed the joints, even if there was no response. It was physical therapy, homemade, patient, quiet. Jake didn't know if it would work, but it felt right. It felt necessary. Neighbors started to notice. Mrs. Denny, who lived across the street, waved from her porch. "I didn't know you had a dog, Jake." He shrugged. "I didn't. He found me." She smiled. "He's lucky." Jake didn't reply, because in truth, he was the lucky one. One day, something shifted. Jake was cooking when he heard a noise, like nails lightly scratching the floor. He turned fast. Shadow had pulled himself off the blanket. He hadn't stood, not fully, but he had dragged himself forward, just a few inches. That was enough to send Jake across the room, dropping the spatula in his hand. He crouched beside Shadow. "You trying to move?" Shadow looked up at him, and then, without warning, leaned his head gently into Jake's hand. Jake didn't cry, but he did whisper, "Good boy." That night, Jake stayed up sketching plans for a makeshift dog sling. something that could support Shadow's weight while letting his legs dangle free, encouraging motion. He found an old backpack harness, cut some straps, and spent hours stitching until it resembled something halfway useful. Each day, Jake lifted Shadow into the sling and gently guided him across the yard, just a few steps, then back, over and over again. The first few tries, Shadow's legs did nothing, but then they twitched, small, barely visible. But Jake noticed, and so did Shadow. More days passed. The progress was slow, but it was there. Jake wasn't sleeping through the night, but when he woke up, he had a reason to get out of bed. He'd wake up before the sun, boil Shadow's breakfast, check the sling, fill water bowls, measure supplements. There was structure, purpose, something the war had taken from him a long time ago. But then came the night that nearly broke them both. Jake had gone into town to grab dog food and a new mat. When he returned, he found Shadow lying in the corner, not moving, eyes half open, breathing shallow. Panic surged. Jake dropped everything and ran to him. Shadow, hey buddy. No response. Jake checked for a pulse. It was there barely. He wrapped him in a blanket, lifted him into the truck, and drove to Dr. Lane's clinic, breaking speed limits he hadn't touched in years. Dr. Lane met him at the door. They worked through the night. An infection, a fever, likely from the weakened immune system and malnourishment. He's fighting, Dr. Lane said, but he's weak. This is the part where a lot of people give up. Jake looked at her, jaw tight. We're not giving up. He stayed in the clinic overnight, sitting in the corner, watching the machines beep, watching Shadow breathe. And sometime around dawn, Shadow opened his eyes again. It took a week, but Shadow recovered. And from that point on, something in him changed. He started responding faster. Ears perked at Jake's voice. Tail thumped weakly at feeding time. And then, one afternoon he stood. No sling, no help, just stood, wobbly, shaky, but on his own feet. Jake was speechless. He froze mid-step, holding a bowl of water, not wanting to interrupt the moment. Shadow stood for about 5 seconds, then fell back down. But 5 seconds might as well have been forever. Jake sank to the floor beside him, gently rubbed his head. You did it. And every day after that, Shadow tried again. 5 seconds became 10. 10 became a step. A step became a slow walk across the yard. Neighbors stopped in their tracks. Strangers watched from their porches. Word spread fast in that small town. The war veteran and the dog who couldn't walk, now both moving forward, one step at a time. Jake didn't talk about the war much anymore, but he talked about Shadow, at the store, at the clinic, at the diner, and in doing so, he began to find pieces of himself again. The part of him that once believed in purpose, in fighting for something, in not giving up, even when it all looked hopeless. Jake and Shadow began going on short walks in the early morning, just around the block. Shadow still limped. Jake still kept a hand on his harness, just in case. But there was something beautiful about the image of them side by side. Two survivors, walking toward the sunrise. And for the first time in years, Jake didn't feel invisible. It had started with pity, maybe even guilt. Jake didn't know exactly why he bought that broken dog in the first place. But now things were different. It wasn't pity anymore. It was connection. A quiet one, a steady one, but real. Every day started the same. 5:30 a.m. Shadow would wake before the sun, lifting his head slightly when Jake stirred. Jake would stretch, rub his face, and whisper, "Mornin', soldier." Shadow would thump his tail once against the floor in reply. Just once. That was enough. By week 5, Jake had built a small wooden ramp from the porch to the backyard, so Shadow wouldn't need help with the steps. It wasn't pretty, just some plywood and leftover nails, but Shadow used it every single morning, climbing slowly, limping, but always trying. And Jake, he was changing too. The man who once couldn't stand the sound of barking now found himself talking to a dog like he was an old friend, telling stories, joking about the mailman, laughing when Shadow growled at the vacuum cleaner like it was the enemy. And the nightmares, they didn't go away, but when they came, Shadow was there. Jake would wake up drenched in sweat, heart racing, and find Shadow pressed against his side, eyes wide open, as if saying, "It's okay. You're not alone this time." That kind of comfort didn't need words. Jake started bringing Shadow into town more often. At first, people stared, not in a rude way, but with surprise. "Is that the same dog from the gas station?" Someone whispered at the market. Jake nodded. "Yeah, he's walking now." "God," the woman said. "I thought he'd never make it." Jake looked down at Shadow, who was sniffing a nearby tree stump like it held government secrets. "He made it," Jake said quietly. Dr. Lane was stunned by his progress. He should have taken months longer to get this far, she said. You must be doing something right. Jake shrugged. We don't quit. She smiled. Well, whatever it is, it's working. Shadow had gained weight. His fur had started to shine again, and the dull emptiness in his eyes had been replaced with something brighter. Not joy, not yet, but curiosity, awareness, presence. That was more than Jake ever expected. One afternoon, while Jake was replacing a broken tile on the porch, he heard barking. He froze. Shadow never barked. Not once in all these weeks. But this bark, deep, loud, confident, was coming from the backyard. Jake rushed around the house to see what was going on. Shadow stood on all fours, chest puffed, tail high, barking at a squirrel on the fence like he was claiming territory. Jake stared. Shadow turned his head, spotted Jake, and barked again, shorter this time, like saying, "You see that? I got this." Jake grinned. It wasn't just recovery anymore. It was transformation. Every week brought new moments. The first time Shadow chased a ball. The first time he barked at the mail truck. The first time he jumped, yes, jumped, onto the couch uninvited and sprawled out like he owned it. Jake didn't scold him. He just laughed. It was a sound he hadn't heard from his own mouth in years. But with progress came memories. One morning, Jake took Shadow to the woods behind his house. The trail was quiet, lined with old trees and golden light breaking through the branches. Jake loved this place, but he hadn't walked it in years. Not since coming back from overseas. Too many memories. But that day, with Shadow trotting ahead, tail wagging, he decided to follow. And about a quarter-mile in, it hit him. The silence, the crunch of leaves, the exact feel of patrols in Afghanistan. His hand instinctively went toward his waist, where his sidearm would have been. He froze. His breath shortened. His vision blurred. Panic tightened his chest like a fist. And then Shadow returned. Walked right up, nudged Jake's leg, looked up at him. A reminder. This wasn't the battlefield. This was now. And Jake wasn't alone. He sank to the ground, leaned back against a tree, and took slow, deep breaths. Shadow didn't move, just lay beside him, matching his breathing, beat for beat. That day, Jake didn't just survive a panic attack. He beat it with a dog who was supposed to be broken. Jake started journaling again, something the VA had pushed him to do for years. He never could stick with it, but now each page told a story about Shadow. Day 41, he growled at the neighbor's cat like he was guarding a base. Day 47, Shadow barked at the mirror. I think he finally noticed how handsome he is. Day 52, he didn't just climb the ramp, he ran up it. The journal wasn't just about Shadow anymore. It was about healing, about finding pieces of himself in the wag of a tail or the joy in a bark. Then came the vet visit that would change everything. Dr. Lane did another scan, just to be safe. She smiled, staring at the results. He's clear, she said. No permanent damage, no complications. He's fully recovered. Jake nodded slowly. I knew he was better, but hearing it like that, he's not just better, she added. He's thriving. Honestly, Jake, this dog's a miracle. Jake looked down at Shadow, who was licking the vet's hand like he'd just saved the world. Yeah, Jake said. He is. Jake started thinking about applying for a service dog license. Shadow already acted like one. He'd walk at Jake's side without a leash. He'd stand in front of him in crowded places, creating space. But more than that, he understood Jake in a way no human ever had. He'd alert Jake when he was spiraling. He'd wake him from nightmares, press his head against Jake's chest until the shaking stopped. Shadow wasn't just a dog. He was a partner, a guardian, a reason. One night, Jake sat on the porch with a beer in his hand and Shadow's head on his knee. The stars were out, the town was quiet, and Jake whispered, I didn't save you, buddy. You saved me. Shadow looked up. Then, as if understanding every word, he let out one slow, soft bark and rested his head back down. Jake didn't know what tomorrow held. He didn't pretend everything was perfect. He still had bad days, still had demons, but now he had someone to face them with, and that changed everything. It was supposed to be a normal morning. The sky was overcast, and the air carried that thick stillness that often came before a summer storm. Jake had planned a short walk with Shadow before the rain rolled in. He clipped the leash on, though Shadow barely needed it anymore. They stepped outside, Shadow walking confidently beside him, his gait stronger now, more even. No more dragging paws, no more fear. The neighborhood was quiet. A few cars passed. A jogger waved. Jake felt steady, calm, like things had finally balanced out. Like maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to believe in something again. But then the sound came, a loud bang, sharp, metallic. Shadow froze. So did Jake. Another bang, followed by a shout. It was coming from the old grocery store at the edge of town, 2 blocks ahead. Jake's body tensed instinctively. It wasn't just the sound, it was the memory it triggered. Gunfire, explosions, command shouts, all crashing down like a wave. His knees locked, breath caught, but Shadow didn't panic. He looked up at Jake, alert, ears high, but grounded, present. Jake gripped the leash tighter. Come on, let's go see. They walked, faster now, and as they rounded the corner, they saw it. A small crowd had gathered, smoke rising from the alley behind the store. Someone shouting, a teenage boy pacing, panicked, holding a phone to his ear. And then Jake saw her. An elderly woman had fallen beside the dumpster, unconscious, or worse, blood on her head. A man stood frozen nearby, unsure what to do. Somebody call 911. Jake didn't think. He just ran. Shadow followed without hesitation. Even as the shouting grew louder, Jake knelt beside the woman, checking her pulse. She's breathing, weak but alive. The boy said, she works in the store. Slipped on the metal grate, hit her head. Jake nodded. Ambulance, on the way. But there was another sound now, faint, rhythmic beeping. Jake looked around, trying to locate it. Then he saw it, an oxygen tank nearby. A medic bag spilled open on the pavement. She was a retired nurse, someone said, kept supplies with her at the store. Jake didn't wait. He tore into the bag, searching, heart pounding. Years of combat medic training kicking in like a second skin. Shadow, stay, he commanded. But the dog didn't listen. Instead, he moved to Jake's side and nudged the oxygen mask with his nose. Jake blinked. It was exactly what he needed. He grabbed the mask, secured the line to the tank, and gently positioned it over the woman's mouth. She stirred slightly, weak breath, but it was working. Jake could feel it in his bones, the old instincts returning. Not fear, purpose, and Shadow. He didn't move an inch. He stood watch like a sentinel, not barking, not afraid, just present, just like he had always been. Minutes later, the ambulance arrived. Paramedics took over. Jake stepped back, hand shaking slightly, not from fear, but from adrenaline, from the flood of past and present colliding and finally making sense. A paramedic looked at him. You military? Jake nodded. The paramedic nodded back. Thanks for holding her over. That oxygen might have saved her. Jake looked down at Shadow. It wasn't just me. The paramedic smiled. Smart dog. But Shadow didn't care about praise. He was watching Jake's hand, waiting for a signal, a word, anything. Jake knelt, wrapped his arms around him, and whispered, You did good, boy. You did real good. And in that moment, under gray skies, in the middle of a street still echoing with sirens, Jake finally understood something he hadn't been able to see before. Shadow hadn't just learned to walk again. He hadn't just healed. He'd become something Jake didn't know he needed. A partner, a protector, a mirror of his own strength. That night, Jake sat on the porch again. Shadow lay beside him, head resting on Jake's boot. Jake didn't say much. He didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't the kind that screamed anymore. It was the kind that heals, the kind that speaks louder than words ever could. Because when a broken man saves a broken dog, sometimes the dog saves the man right back. And sometimes they both learn to run again. Jake never expected a paralyzed dog to give him his life back. But that's exactly what happened. He had spent years drifting, a man worn down by memories, haunted by things left unsaid, things left undone. He thought he was done feeling anything at all. And then, in a dusty parking lot, he made a decision that didn't make sense. He said yes to a broken dog, and in doing so, he said yes to healing. Shadow didn't just walk again. He ran, he played, he lived. But more importantly, he reminded Jake how to live, too. Every bowl of food, every stumble forward, every late-night breath shared in silence, they were all pieces of a bigger truth, that even the most shattered lives can be rebuilt. That sometimes, what we think we're saving is actually saving us. Jake and Shadow became local legends in that small town. The war vet and the miracle dog. You'd see them on morning walks, side by side, step for step, as if they had always belonged to each other. And maybe they did, because healing doesn't always come with sirens or speeches. Sometimes it limps quietly into your life, sits down beside you, and stays. And when it does, if you're lucky enough to recognize it, you don't just find a pet. You find purpose. You find peace. You find home.